Good afternoon. I'm Bill Case. This is the latest in our oral history series. Today we have Scot Dewhirst. Welcome, Scot.
Thank you, Bill.
And Scot, you have a very fine career as an attorney here in Columbus that has touched German Village in certain ways throughout.
I've been there a long time. I bought my first house in German Village when I was right out of law school. I graduated from law school in 1978, and then I bought my first house on Frankfurt Street, right across the street from Max and Irma's in 1979. So I always jokingly said I kind of came across historic preservation by accident. Since I bought my house in German Village, nobody told me that there was an Architectural Control Commission or a Historic Preservation District. I just bought it because I thought it was a nice house. You would think as a lawyer I should have known better, but I bought the house without even knowing that I had to go to this, commission to do anything I wanted to do to my house. So I kind of learned after the fact.
You had a fire.
I had a fire in 1983 in the house there. I was out of town on a whitewater raft trip, 4 cell phones, and my house burned. The tenant, a little kid, started a fire in the house and came driving down the street and saw the entire house was laying in the middle of the street. My beautiful red brick double house was charred black in the front, and then that was my first really getting involved with the commission pretty seriously, as we had to then go through a lot of issues involving the renovation of the house and the restoration of it in the best way possible from the fire.
At the time you moved down into German Village, you also joined the city attorney's office.
I was hired in the city attorney's office the same year, the month after I bought the house, interesting enough, not in reverse, so luckily I got the job, and then began working in the city attorney's office in the prosecutor's division, and I ran all of the mediation programs, the intake programs that dealt with complaints that would be filed in the city.
The mayor at that time was Greg Lashutke.
No, the mayor at that time was Buck Reinhardt.
Oh, he was city attorney.
Yeah, Greg Lashutke was a city attorney at that time, so I was hired by Greg, who was also a resident of the village at that time. Did not know him then, but I got to know him after he hired me.
What did you do then when you became a city attorney?
Well, my main function was to run the divisions that related to trying to resolve complaints by using mediation or out-of-court processes. We dealt with a lot of complaints that involved code enforcement. We dealt with interpersonal disputes, trying to resolve the disputes between the people who were having the conflicts, as well as doing the investigative division of the office at the time that would look into complaints, look into the issues that needed to be handled. So I did that for approximately 6 years. And then Ron O'Brien, who at that time was my direct boss, who was the city attorney, who was the city prosecutor, was elected as city attorney. This would have been in the fall of 1985. And then after he was elected city attorney, he asked me to join him in City Hall as his executive assistant. So I moved from the prosecutor's division down to the civil division of the city attorney's office. This is another section of it. And then as part of those job duties, I was appointed to be the attorney for the development department.
And in that role, you first came into contact with some of the historic commissions.
Yeah, I pretty quickly went from working in the criminal arena to suddenly becoming a civil attorney for the zoning issues. And as a part of doing that, I was then naturally assumed all of the different boards and commissions that were through the development department. So that would be the Development Commission, the Board of Zoning Adjustment, the Graphics Commission, all of the neighborhood commissions, and the Historic Preservation Commission. So,
what sorts of issues would come before you in that type of representation?
Anything that related to housing, building, and zoning. So tearing down buildings, obviously in the historic districts, dealing with the complaints that were coming from there as far as people not wanting to make changes to properties that weren't approved, so appeals from that. Dealing with all kind of administrative issues that related to housing and building and zoning, graphics.
By then, you were a little bit more intimately familiar with the German Village Commission.
I knew it because I still lived there at the time, so I had now lived there for 6 or 7 years. And then I can remember attending my first official meeting as the attorney for the commission. This would have been in 1986. And that's when the meeting house was there on the corner of Columbus and Lozelle. which I think is Tom Gross's house, if Tom Gross is still there. I don't know if he is or not, but it was that house, that two-story right on the corner. And I can remember arriving about 4 o'clock, and I was amazed that at 1 o'clock in the morning, the meeting was still going on.
That was not that unusual, I guess.
It was pretty common, yeah. I mean, because every application had to be heard. That we didn't have any pre-approval processes at that time. So by statute, by the Columbus City Code, every application had to go through the process, and the 7 commissioners had to then make decisions on what to do about it.
My understanding is you had some role in some reforms that helped that situation out.
After I became on the commission, so I served in the role of the attorney for the commissions for a couple years, and then I left the city and went into private practice in January of 1988. And then after I left the city attorney's office in January of '88, by then Greg Lashutka was the mayor, and he appointed me, and I was still a resident of German Village, he appointed me to the commission in 1988. And so over the years, you know, one of the things that I was always concerned about, customer service, if that's an appropriate word. You know, one of the biggest criticisms of the commission was nobody liked to have to go and get their, you know, their plans approved. You know, and that was a constant fight that was always there. You know, we would jokingly say it's like control my neighbor but don't control me. You know, and we always kind of felt that, you know, even as people that had our own applications going forward. You know, but obviously the controls, you know, that were there for historic preservation were what really made German Village German Village. It's what kept the character. It's kept the heritage that was there. But much like my situation, many people were still buying properties and they didn't know, you know, that they had these regulations, or they didn't know that, you know, it's like, how can you tell me what I'm allowed to do to my house? How can you tell me what color I'm allowed to paint my house? Because it was anything that really related to the exterior. You know, that one of the clarifications was the commission had no control over anything that the people wanted to do decorating-wise inside, but if it was outside, you know, whether it be the front, the side, the back, you know, that had to be approved, you know, based upon city law, you know.
It sounds like if somebody wanted to paint their house a different color, that might result in a long meeting, long hearing.
Well, you know, I think that there was obviously criticism that sometimes people felt that the commission micromanaged, you know, and I'm sure there were periods of time when that was probably the case. You know, as, you know, looking at, you know, this is before we had perhaps the same type of acceptability of many of the historic preservation issues that we have now. It was more viewed as you're interfering with my right to do what I want to do to my house.
What were you able to do to address those issues?
Well, one of the things we did was we looked at those kind of cases that were pretty standard in nature. You know, yes, we controlled colors, you know, but there was a historic preservation color palette, you know, that many different companies would put out. If you wanted to paint your house one of those colors on that color palette, you could do it. It would get approved. You know, so technically speaking, you know, even though we controlled colors, you know, I mean, you weren't going to paint your house pink, you know, or chartreuse necessarily, because those weren't approved historic preservation colors, but, you know, people weren't coming to paint their houses pink or chartreuse. There was an application for pink one time. So there was still some of that danger that was there. And there were still some of the houses that pre-existed or predated the commission, because the commission really went into effect as a statute for the Columbus in the early 60s. And so there would be people at that point, now we're in the 80s, you know, it's 20, 30 years later, but still some of the same residents who had lived in those homes for all those years, you know, would still be within the jurisdiction of the commission. One of the things that was clear by the statute is we couldn't make anybody do anything. So we didn't have any control over going to somebody and say, you've got to change this in your house. You know, if it pre-existed the commission, if it was there, it was allowed to be kept. However, if anybody wanted to make changes, then those changes by city law had to come before the commission. And so we were looking at those kind of situations that were pretty standard in nature. Everybody in German Village knows there are the guidelines, you know, and there's always controversy about what are guidelines. You know, and guidelines are exactly what they sound like. They're guidelines. even those guidelines are actually passed as an ancillary part of the Columbus City Code. So it's just not that the commission, says these are the guidelines. I mean, they have to actually be, clearly outlined and demarcated, presented to City Council, be open to the hearing process, and then be approved, by council as the official guidelines for the village. We were looking at those issues that might be more administrative in nature, paint colors, or maintenance and repair. I mean, people would even have to come to the commission, to do maintenance and repair, even though you could do like with like. So technically speaking, if somebody had a pink house, they could repaint it pink. That we couldn't make them change the color, even though we might encourage them to do that. So anything that was existing, they were allowed to keep. So we tried to set up the procedures in place that maintenance, repairs, paint colors, pretty standard things that would be done, that would be approved no matter what, that we would set up a process where people could have what we called pre-approval, that we couldn't do a pre-approval legally, but what pre-approval basically meant that if your application had these items on it, you didn't need to really come to the meeting, that we would have our legal pre-meetings. If we had any concerns, we would get those questions out to you, and then it would pretty much then be voted on by the commission as just kind of a rubber stamp what the person wanted to do. So that took the meetings from lasting until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, to maybe 10 o'clock at night.
That's also called staff approval?
Staff approvals, yeah. I mean, staff approvals, again, staff can't approve, but staff can basically say, this is something that falls within a standard approval. We'll present it to the commission, as something that we would agree to, and then the commission just votes to stamp it and to approve it.
You also mentioned the pre-meeting, which I've also heard referred to as a business meeting.
Yeah, yes.
So those were all practices and new procedures that you played a part in implementing.
Yeah, we would have started those in the early 90s. And part of that process was, again, let's look at the application ahead of time, instead of somebody coming to the commission meeting, sitting there for hours, and then say, well, you don't have this, or this is a problem, you now need to come back next month with the information. That we would have these business meetings ahead of time that would be open public meetings, so they met the requirements of sunshine laws in the code. And then if there were issues identified that we needed more information on, we would be able to get those out to the people before the meeting, so that they would hopefully be able to come to the meeting and then get their approval. Because we were also going through situations where it might take months and months, to get items approved because the applications necessarily weren't complete.
And that helped the process, getting meetings shortened?
Well, it helped meetings getting shortened, but more importantly, what we were trying to do was we were trying to be more responsive to the public and people in their application. I mean, we're not there to dictate to people, we are there to administer the code, but we wanted to try to make sure we were doing that in a way that made the commission more user-friendly. And let's face it, over the years, the commission has never been viewed, as, I hate to use the word they weren't viewed as a friend of the residents, but that's probably what most people would have said. They were viewed as a necessary evil. Even though property values continue to rise over the decades pretty dramatically, and the tax base was great there, and the property values continued, and that it was because of the historic preservation controls, in my opinion, that made it a pure, historic neighborhood. Let's also remember that many people still didn't quite understand historic preservation law, that a lot of people thought that you couldn't tell somebody what to do to the exterior of the property as long as it was zoned property. But historic preservation was actually a zoning regulation that allowed there to be appearance review. But in order to get that, there had to be all these legal requirements, of the community had to be approved under all kind of federal and Department of Interior standards. It wasn't that you could just suddenly say, German Village is a historic preservation community, and we can then make people do this to their properties. I mean, German Village is very strictly construed as far as its boundaries, and the boundaries are done based upon historic surveys under federal standards, and as a result of that, it creates a district that these regulations then are supportable by law, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court has heard those cases and said, yes, we can regulate them.
Scott, you mentioned relationships with the community. Tell us a little bit about the relationships that the commission and you had with the German Village Society during your tenure.
Well, it was an interesting mix. I mean, we were two separate entities, even though I think that most of the public did not view us as being different. They viewed that there was German Village Commission Society. And I think if you would have asked most people that were really not involved actively on either the commission level or the society level, and those people understood, but most residents would just mix the two up. And so they would blame the society if they didn't get an approval, on their application, which the society had nothing to do with it. So the society was the neighborhood association, that supported the historic preservation efforts, but the commission was then the, legal, kind of hard hand that had to administer the code. So, the commission sometimes felt that the society was able to basically criticize the commission because they were representing the residents and the neighborhood and the community, and the commission then did the dirty work to make sure that everything was kept in place. I'm not sure I ever heard the society say that the commission shouldn't be doing what they were doing, but it kind of kept a tension that was there over the years. I mean, we were a guest. When I say a guest of the society, because we would have our meetings, in the society meeting house, both the old house, meeting house on Lozelle and Columbus, and then when it moved to the new, meeting house on 3rd Street, we would always have our meetings there, but really there was no relationship between the two entities. One was a neighborhood association, the other one was a creation of Columbus City Council, as an actual zoning board, that had appeal rights all the way up to the Supreme Court if people would have appealed it that far.
You told me that relationship, you sensed that it improved though during your tenure.
It went both ways. I mean, I think an interesting story, which I can talk about, I think, openly, is this probably would have been in 1997. So I was on the end of my 3rd term. Commissioners served 3-year terms. So Ann Fanta was also a commissioner, and she had been appointed at the same time that I was appointed. So we were each in the 9th year of our 3rd term, having served on the commission. And we both received a phone call one morning after we had been at the commission until about 11 or 12 the night before. We both received a call the next morning from the president of the society, who basically indicated that thank you for the work you've done on the commission for the last 8 years, but we're then going to basically recommend that 2 new people be appointed and that neither of you be reappointed back to the commission again, which was kind of a shock. Because we thought we had been doing good jobs and had been working in positive ways, and I think this kind of brought to a head years of, I'm not sure what the issues were at that time, and the years since then. This is now, what are we, 2013, so we're, 15 years after that phone call, but I think there was still this feeling that the commissioners really were not responsive to the society. In the Columbus City Code, it allows the society to make recommendations for 2 of the positions. So the code actually says, here's where the commissioners should come from, even though they're mayoral appointments. There can be recommendations. And the society thought that Ann Fanta's position and my position were the 2 positions that the society controlled. Nobody really knew. I mean, that was part of the problem. And so it was like, well, since these are our 2 appointments, which they're really not appointments, I mean, they're mayoral appointments, but they're 2 recommendations, that they basically said, well, we want to get rid of those 2, and we've got 2 people we would like to appoint instead. And basically, I don't think I'm talking out of turn to say, kind of got frustrated with it and said, well, if that's the case, then I don't care what it is. I don't care whether I'm an appointment of the society or not. I'm done. My term's up. I'm just going to leave. And I stayed and basically was determined that my position wasn't a society position. With a fair amount of controversy going on at the time over this. So there was this really jockeying for control. There were lots of meetings that were held. I don't don't take any credit that it was about me. I didn't take it personally in one sense, because I thought I did a wonderful job in what I was doing. I think it was just a matter of the evolution of the two entities. And basically, the society was eventually told that, well, they didn't have control of my position, that I was in a different appointment position, and I was reappointed, I guess I would say, against the wishes of the society at that point. And then I think everything started turning around pretty dramatically. That both entities said, wait a minute, what just happened? I mean, that was a very polarizing event for both entities and created some negative communication. And we said, how do we make this better? How do we create a better relationship, since we're all serving the public, we're all serving the residents of German Village? And we really had a lot of good meetings after that, a lot of ways of working together better, streamlining procedures more. One of the things that I take pride in was bringing up the issue of, let's create what are now called the Caretaker Awards, the Caretaker of a Legacy. And actually, came up with the different awards that we began talking about, so that the commission would actually, these would be commission awards that the commissioners would nominate and vote on, but they would then be presented at a society event. And then the society has now even created their President's Award that goes along with that. So that was an attempt for us, and this would have been early 1998. This was an attempt to say, let's work together. Let's show a united front, and let's start recognizing, the real purpose of why we're here is the houses and the residents, and making sure that we're beginning to recognize them in an appropriate way. So I think that's really, in addition to the changes that we made to make the commission more user-friendly, even though I'm sure lots of people will say there's nothing user-friendly about the commission. You got to go back 25 years when you were sitting there for 6 hours waiting for your application to come up, and it might be out of paint color. And
Scott,
people don't need to do that now.
Scott, tell us about some of the noteworthy issues that came before you when you were on the commission.
Yeah, it was always a challenge between zoning issues, where the commission really doesn't have any control over zoning.
They can just recommend.
Or variances. They can only make recommendations about what they think should happen on those. So if there would be a big project, or there would be a business change, or somebody would try to take a house and turn it into something commercial, then the commission was required to hold hearings on that, and then make a recommendation to whatever body, whether it be the BZA or city council, would really vote the yay or nay on that. So there were a number of those. I don't think we're talking out of turn to indicate that there were many applications over the years to expand Lindy's, to expand Max and Irma's, to deal with many of the different business establishments. Back then, there was pretty much and I was talking to my one business partner, Brian Arch, today, who also lives in German Village and at one point was on the board, and he said, he harked back to, the 80s and the 90s when the village really had a very anti-commercial view, that they didn't really want business, they didn't want an extension of, a community like the Short North turned in to be. And whenever there was a business application or a store or a new restaurant, it pretty much met with a lot of opposition from both the society and I'm talking in general, and from the neighborhood, because German Village viewed itself as a residential neighborhood. Remember, German Village stops at Pearl Alley, and that was intentional when council did the approvals back in the 60s, so we didn't go over to the commercial strip. If you, I think it's interesting, if you drive down Pearl Alley, as you're driving south on Pearl Alley, it's all parking lots and commercial on the right side of the alley, and it's almost purely 100% residential on the left side of the alley. That line of demarcation actually occurred there.
3rd Street, which is viewed as kind of the commercial hub of German Village, is actually zoned residential.
Yeah, exactly. And so whenever there would be an attempt, almost all of the village is zoned residential or R2F residential in one sense, with some restrictions. So there was always that issue of expansion of commercial uses would always create a big challenge.
Was that primarily a parking problem, or was it just a more opposition to commercial in general?
Clearly, lots of things were driven by parking. But lots of things were also driven by just a general opposition to commercial. I mean, it's like, traditionally a neighborhood like German Village, and if you drive through it, you still see it. The commercial establishments were primarily at some of the main crossroads. Max and Irma's right at the corner of Frankfurt, and Third. The different commercial buildings that were built as commercial buildings, at many of those main intersections as you go through the village. You would see that's where they were located historically, in those neighborhoods, and that you didn't expand the commercial to the rest of the block, you would just do them at those intersections.
During your tenure, the commission was confronted with more additions to existing building and even additions to the additions.
Yeah, that's what I always like to say. That was the time, I think, the commission started in the 60s, and then the properties began to change over the years as far as the approvals were done and restoration was done of many of the properties. And then we get into the 80s and then the 90s where those properties are being sold sometimes 2 or now 3 times, and then people are wanting, and every time it gets sold, the property values go up more and more, and then when the property's values go up, what people want are, they want more space, or they want a garage, or they want a curb cut. And let's face it, when German Village was established, there were no cars. So we would have carriage houses off the alleys, but you didn't have curb cuts off the main streets where people would have their driveways. So there was a lot of attempt to try to have people that were creating what we called parking in the front yards. So that was a big challenge all the time that created lots of problems with people, that you're telling me I can't park my car on my property. And it's like, well, we're not approving the curb cuts, because, it would not be appropriate to park your car in the front yard. One of the challenges statutorily that the commission has, and remember, our charge was not our personal view. Our charge was one that was created by code, by Columbus City Code, and that Columbus City Code is regulated indirectly by Department of Interior standards of historic preservation. So this is not just a subjective, this is what we think should happen. There are some pretty strict, historic architectural control standards that we were forced to comply with.
The concept of a governmental entity applying standards other than strict zoning was something that there was a little resistance to even during the time you were on the commission.
Oh yeah, well, when you think about it, not going into the legal end of things, but I do some speaking on this. I mean, the very first case that went to the United States Supreme Court was the Penn Central case out of Grand Central Station case out of New York City that Jackie Kennedy was heavily involved in at that time. And that was the case that basically went to the United States Supreme Court that established the historic preservation controls as something that was enforceable, and that you could have these standards of review as to appearance. That recognizing that, as well as the use of properties, the appearance of properties, if they fell in these appropriate historic districts. Now people would confuse it because they would say, well, that means that any community can create these historic standards. That's not true. There must be the appropriate architectural history and stock of the buildings, and there are those strict standards, as I indicated before, that before you can even apply these kind of standards to your zoning, you must also have that historic background and surveys that have said this is an appropriate community where these standards will withstand the scrutiny of those constitutional standards.
You had a city council member sitting on the commission who had some problem with the regulation on historic preservation.
Yeah, historically, I mean, there are 7 members of the commission, and those positions were created by Columbus City Code. There was a code section, and at one point, it's not there now, but at one point, one of the 7 commissioners was required to be a city council person. I mean, the actual council person. Well, and so there would always be a council person appointed to the commission. Most of them would not appear, so instead of having 7 people, we had 6, so that created issues about finding the appropriate quorums. But I think it's public record information. Maury Portman who was a longtime city council member, well-respected, wonderful person. He was the council designated commissioner for a period of time, and he started coming to the meetings. And after about the third meeting, he just lost it, where he said, I don't understand how we can sit here and tell people what they're allowed to do to their properties. And it's like, Maury, don't say that. I mean, this is the code that you pass. This is the code that we have to regulate. And he could not understand why we could do that. And it was the Columbus City Code that said we had to do that. So if a council person, had those feelings, I mean, obviously it resonates with why residents would feel the same thing. But some of the other, the properties, I remember clearly if people go back, there used to be a gas station at the corner of 3rd and Livingston, across from Katzinger's. That building that's there, was the result, and I don't think anybody was ever thrilled with how that building ended up. It was always a challenge between, what does the commission, want to have there? It's not our property, it's not our building. So if somebody creates a building that meets the standards, we were pretty much obligated to approve that, even though we could try to challenge people to do certain things to those properties. But that used to be a gas station that was there. Another one of the projects, I remember one time when Columbia Gas came through the village down Pearl Alley and basically said that everybody's gas meters had to be in the front of the house along the alley. And it was like, and they changed them all and never came to the commission. And it's like, wait a minute, you're Columbia Gas, but that doesn't mean you're exempt from the architectural control issues, which was very much concerned with streetscape. And streetscape was not having these large outside, this is when they were moving the meters from inside to outside, and so these large gas meters suddenly appeared all the way down Pearl Alley in front of the properties, and since those properties on Pearl Alley were right on the sidewalk, you then had gas meters all down the sidewalks.
How was that resolved?
You got to change it. So it was a commission basically saying, that's, you can't make that change. If you would have come to the commission before you did it, they did that without coming to the commission. Another big project was all the changes that occurred in the park, in Schiller Park. That went on for quite a period of time, and at first the city didn't want to come to the commission. And it's like, we don't have to come to the commission, we're the city. It's like, who says? I mean, it doesn't say the city's exempt from its own laws, and so they then had to present all the plans, and we were able to work with them on making the appropriate changes to do the things that happened to the meeting house and the lake and the bridge and the plaza and all those things that happened during that perspective.
When you left the German Village Commission, yeah, that was in 2000.
Yes.
That was not the end of your service on boards.
I went then from the German Village Commission after 12 years to, I was appointed to then what was called the Board of Commission Appeals.
Tell us about that.
The Board of Commission Appeals was a new body that was appointed that was established in the 90s, mid-90s. That was a specific commission that was established to hear appeals, to make the appeal process work better. That, we got to remember that even though the German Village Commission would make these decisions, people were allowed to file appeals from those decisions. We were not the final say. We were a zoning body, and any zoning body, has to follow due process requirements, and so people have their appeal rights. Well, the appeal right at that time was directly to the court, and so it was a pretty onerous, task for people, especially for a minor issue that they didn't like, to have to then file an entire full-blown administrative appeal to the courts. And so at that point around the country, there was a pretty much a consensus that we ought to go to some intermediate body. So the Board of Commission Appeals was this intermediate body that would hear then appeals from the Historic Preservation Commissions. And by that time we had German, Italian, Victorian, the Historic Resources Commission itself, and then the Brewery District Commission. So we had 5 different ones.
From what I understand of the Board of Commission Appeals, it can take note of, perhaps more than the historic commissions can, of hardship issues?
The commissions could do the same thing. I mean, people were always allowed to come to the commission by statute and say that we had one of two legal conditions. And again, this was something that many people didn't understand, even though that was their legal right to have that heard, and it was in the application materials, that if a person said, this is going to work an undue economic hardship upon me, that would be a claim for relief, that I shouldn't have to do this because of that reason. Another standard was what was called unusual and compelling circumstances, something that was so unique to this property that the guidelines didn't work. So those were always present even at the commission level, but those then became the standards of appeal, that people could go to. That it wasn't just I didn't like the decision, that there are other aspects of it that they would appeal on.
Are you still serving in that role?
No, I served on that for a little over 4 years, and then at that point I then was wanting to really do more work from a private attorney perspective in zoning and historic preservation, and it's not appropriate from an ethics perspective to be on those bodies if I'm going to be doing that kind of work in this arena as well as in other parts of the state.
And your office is in this beautiful Victorian
So
structure?
I'm in the town Street Historic District. So I live in an old house up in the Circles in the Victorian Village area. My office went from German Village to, we moved from our office in German Village to this office that's subject to historic preservation controls here. So I live with it too, from that perspective.
You still have occasion, though, to deal with the German Village Commission from time to time.
I represent clients before it, not often, because I don't like to encourage people to have to take attorneys to the commission. That you work with the commission in a positive way, and I think that's a very effective way to do that. I did have a go around, I should say, I guess, so I'll criticize the commission. Yeah, exactly, residents have that. I still own my same house in German Village that I rent, that is right across the street from Max and Irma's. And there was a big dispute that occurred in the mid-'80s, before I was even on the commissions, regarding the building of the greenhouse addition to Max and Irma's, when Barry Zacks owned Max and Irma's back then. And I can remember having meetings in my living room across the street from it, as far as we were, even as neighbors, designing, and working with them as far as what would we like to see if you were going to get our neighborhood support. And we worked out something with them, and then that greenhouse addition was built, which was much different than what was originally proposed. And interestingly enough, then last year, which would have been 2012, 25 years later, over 27 years later, Max and Irma's was then looking to buy the property directly to the south, and they needed zoning variances and different kind of things to do that. So they were going to buy that house, expand the restaurant on the first floor into the house, and put their corporate office on the second floor and build new restrooms out of the basement and the whole scenario. And that whole process went through the whole commission without anybody in the neighborhood knowing about it. Well, interestingly enough, the exact same people, every house that was still a part of that meeting in 1985, I think it was, all the same people owned the same properties. I mean, it had been stable for that long. I still own my house, neighbors on both sides of me still own the same house, people across the street own the same house. So the same people were present at a meeting, 27 years later, saying, wait a minute, we just dealt with this 27 years ago. And the problem was that because there had not been notice given to the neighborhood, that the commission had already voted to approve the variances, in essence, which would have allowed that project to go forward, and the neighbors knew nothing about it until we received the official notices to show up at City Council, when City Council would then vote upon the final zoning requirements that were needed, with the full unanimous support of the German Village Commission.
And those are the types of events that occur that lead to some reforms. I understand now that there are procedures set in the application process itself where the applicants provide a list of addresses?
There always was that. I mean, so sometimes, so we went over the years, I guess, it's important that we went from really having no support from the city. I mean, when I first started working with the commission in the mid-'80s, there was a part-time person that would show up to administer the agendas from the city. And then over the years, and this occurred originally under Greg Lashutka, there was an actual historic preservation division of the development department established. So there were people assigned as city employees to accept these applications, because they are city applications. Recognizing that commissioners, even though you're appointed, we were legally considered city employees, not paid, but we were under the jurisdiction of the city and the state ethics standards that would apply to that. So the historic preservation offices were established with then representatives assigned, to each of the different commissions to process applications, to make sure the paperwork was done, to deal with appeals. That then kind of reached a crescendo, and then for budget reasons, in the 2000s, a lot of those people were let go. So a lot of the efforts then changed, and one of the things that changed with it was the notices that used to be required. So there were notices always required for all the residents within 125 feet whenever there was any kind of a variance or zoning change proposed.
But nobody to send them out at the city level?
They did send them out at the city level, and then when the staff changed and they lost the staff, then they stopped doing it.
Right.
And then that created the very problem of suddenly we've got a whole commission approving, all these zoning changes, or at least making recommendations on all the zoning changes, and the neighbors had heard nothing about it.
Another thing that's interesting from your interview today is apparently you as council used to go to these meetings, which I don't think is the practice anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go to every one, but I went to them. I mean, because there were issues that were coming, and this is when the commissions were really beginning to come into their own. And German Village was, of course, the premier commission. It was all, really not just in the city but in the country, as far as how we were being viewed as, a preeminent type of, historic preservation community.
And it has been the leader in the city itself as far as how a commission should operate.
I jealously think so. I mean, maybe Italian Village or Victorian Village might not say that at this point, now that they've been there for decades. But clearly German Village was the first, and it always was viewed as, different. Also one of the things that society was able to do, and this is maybe what created some of the conflict too, was the society back in the 80s and early 90s hired for the first time a historic preservation consultant who would be there to work with the property owners to try to help them get their applications complete and ready for the commission. That was a purely privately held person, and then a lot of the other commissions were jealous of that because they didn't have, this is before we had city people, so the German Village had their own privately hired individual, who could help residents get their applications ready, where the other new commission areas, which were now Victorian and Italian, didn't have the resources to do that.
Scott, as you look back on your career, and particularly your service with the German Village Commission, tell me what makes you proudest of that, in that contribution?
I think probably continuity. I mean, I can drive through German Village now, and you can see change, but you can see that it's still the historic preservation community that we all love. I mean, that's why we go there. We jokingly say, don't tell me what I can do to my property, but make sure you don't let my neighbor do something bad. And I think we can all humorously look at that situation and say that's true. The commission being able to regulate the ordinances properly, I think, has been partly what has kept, I say partly because it's the residents, it's the society who have all committed themselves to making that a community that's one to be very proud of. But, I moved there in 1979. I can drive down through there now and there's a sameness, but there's a relevance, there's a newness, that it allows the community to grow, to thrive, to continue to have a high tax base, a high property level. I think it is still one of the most desirable communities in the city to live in, but it looks the same. And one of the reasons for that is because of the focus, and one of the charges of the commission is to be concerned about the streetscape. That's why you don't have cars parking in front yards. That's why you're more concerned about changes being proposed to the front of a house than you are to the rear of the house. Yes, a large addition to the rear of a house dramatically changes it, but how do you then make a house? And I think that's been one of the challenges that I sometimes speak about. How do you make a house relevant in the 21st century when it was built in the 18th century, or the 19th century, I guess, where it would be in the 1800s? That how do you take a house that didn't have cars, and make it relevant to cars? How do you deal with, the large open rooms and everything that people want in their structures now that continue to make the properties valuable properties? If we kept them all as cottages, it wouldn't be a very popular place to live. So I think the relevance of being able to keep the village current, to people's tastes and needs in the 21st century, I think is probably one of the proudest things. It's not anything to do with me. It has to do with, I think, the success of what historic preservation can do.
Scott, thank you very much for
Great.
joining us today.
Okay.
And good luck in all you do.
Thank you.
In your
Thank you.
career. Thank you.
Glad I got the chance to do this.
Great, it was fun.
Good.
All right.